The courtroom was silent. 12 jurors sat motionless. A judge stared toward a large screen at the front of the room. Across the courtroom, a man accused of murder waited for the proceedings to begin. Then a woman appeared on the screen and started speaking. Her voice was calm. Her words were clear. She described the day her life was destroyed. She identified the man responsible. She explained exactly what happened to her. There was only one problem. The woman speaking had been dead for nearly 2 years. Yet somehow, on that day, she became the most important witness in her own murder trial. It sounds impossible. It sounds like something written for a Hollywood courtroom drama. But every part of this story is real. A woman suffered one of the most horrifying attacks imaginable, survived far longer than anyone expected, and spent her remaining days preparing for a courtroom battle she knew she might never live to see. Imagine knowing that your time is running out. Imagine waking up every day in unbearable pain, understanding that the person responsible for your suffering is waiting for a trial that you may never be alive to witness. Most people would focus on survival. Some would focus on revenge. But this woman focused on something else entirely. She focused on making sure the truth would survive, even if she did not. What she left behind would eventually force lawyers, judges, and legal experts across America to confront a question few had ever considered before. Can a murder victim testify after death? And if so, could that testimony help convict the very person accused of taking their life? Before we go deeper into this unbelievable case, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened next would transform a tragic crime into one of the most remarkable courtroom stories in modern American history. A story about determination, justice, and a woman who refused to be silenced, even after death. To understand how a woman could one day appear as a witness in her own murder trial, we have to go back to the beginning. Years before that extraordinary courtroom moment, the woman at the center of this story was simply known as Sarah. She was a mother who had faced more than her share of challenges, but those who knew her described her as resilient, determined, and fiercely devoted to her children. Like many people trying to rebuild their lives after difficult times, Sarah was focused on moving forward. She wanted stability. She wanted a fresh start. Most of all, she wanted a future that looked different from her past. But in 2015, everything changed. Within moments, her life would be shattered by an act so brutal that even seasoned investigators would struggle to forget it. Witnesses would later recall scenes of panic and chaos. Strangers rushed to help. Emergency responders fought to keep her alive. And doctors preparing for the worst quietly doubted whether she would survive the days ahead. Yet Sarah did survive. Against overwhelming odds, she remained alive. Days turned into weeks. Weeks became months. Then months became years. Every day was a battle that few people could truly comprehend. She endured surgeries, painful treatments, and physical suffering that seemed almost impossible to imagine. But while medical teams focused on saving her life, another battle was beginning to take shape. Detectives were building a case, prosecutors were gathering evidence, and the man accused of causing her injuries was waiting for his day in court. At first, the legal process appeared straightforward. The evidence seemed strong. Witnesses had seen what happened. Investigators believed they knew who was responsible. But there was one problem nobody could ignore. Sarah's condition remained uncertain. Despite her determination, there was a growing fear that she might never live long enough to testify before a jury. That possibility raised troubling questions. If the most important witness died before trial, what would happen to the case? Would justice be delayed? Could the accused somehow avoid being held fully accountable? And if Sarah's voice disappeared, who would tell the jury exactly what happened on the day her life changed forever? As prosecutors wrestled with those questions, they made a decision that would eventually make legal history. It was a decision that would preserve Sarah's story in a way few people could have imagined. A decision that would transform her from a victim into a witness whose testimony could outlive her. Across the country, people would later watch in disbelief as the details emerged, because Sarah wasn't spending her remaining time hoping for recovery alone. She was preparing for something else. something far more extraordinary. She was preparing for her own murder trial. Long before her story captured national attention, Sarah was known for something far simpler. She was a mother. Friends remembered her as the kind of person who kept moving forward no matter how difficult life became. She had faced setbacks, disappointments, and struggles that might have broken other people, yet she always seemed to find a way through them. Those closest to her often described her as stubborn in the best possible sense of the word. When life pushed back, Sarah pushed harder. She cared deeply about her children and wanted to build a stable future for them. To the outside world, she looked like someone who was finally beginning to regain control of her life. But many of the most tragic stories do not begin with obvious danger. They begin with trust. They begin with someone who appears to offer companionship, support, and understanding. And that is how Michael entered Sarah's life. At first, there was nothing that seemed especially alarming about their relationship. Like many couples, they spent time together, made plans, and shared ordinary moments. Friends saw them together and had little reason to suspect that anything was seriously wrong. But relationships are often very different behind closed doors. As time passed, cracks began to appear. Small disagreements became heated arguments. Arguments became recurring conflicts. People close to Sarah noticed changes in her mood. Some sensed tension whenever Michael's name came up. Others observed a pattern that made them uncomfortable but struggled to define. What appeared normal on the surface was becoming increasingly difficult beneath it. As months passed, the relationship grew more unstable. Control slowly replaced affection. Trust gave way to suspicion. The conflicts became harder to ignore. Yet from the outside, nobody could fully understand how serious the situation had become. Like many people caught in difficult relationships, Sarah continued trying to make things work. She believed problems could be solved. She believed circumstances could improve. What she could not know was that events were moving toward a confrontation that would change everything. Years later, investigators, journalists, and courtroom observers would look back at this period searching for clues. They would point to warning signs that seemed obvious in hindsight. But at the time, those signs were scattered across ordinary moments, hidden within everyday conversations and private disagreements. No one could have predicted where the story was heading. No one could have imagined that the relationship would eventually end in an act so horrifying that it would shock the entire nation. And no one could have guessed that Sarah's fight for justice was only beginning. On August 2015, what began as an ordinary summer day in Ohio would soon become the defining moment in Sarah's life. The afternoon seemed unremarkable. Cars moved in and out of a local gas station. Customers filled their tanks, bought drinks, and continued with their routines. Nothing suggested that within minutes, dozens of strangers would witness an act so horrifying that many would never forget it. Somewhere in that parking lot, Sarah and Michael found themselves locked in yet another argument. To passing observers, it may have appeared like countless disagreements that happen every day between couples, raised voices, visible frustration, growing tension. But this confrontation was different. Witnesses later recalled sensing that something was seriously wrong. The atmosphere felt charged, uncomfortable. As the argument intensified, nobody around them could have anticipated what was about to happen next. Then, in an instant, the situation erupted into chaos. According to investigators, Michael retrieved gasoline and poured it over Sarah. Before anyone could fully process what was happening, flames suddenly engulfed her body. Panic swept through the parking lot. Some witnesses screamed. Others rushed forward, desperate to help. A few stood frozen in disbelief, unable to comprehend the scene unfolding before their eyes. Within seconds, Sarah was surrounded by fire. Thick smoke filled the air as people scrambled to react. Emergency services were called immediately, but for those who witnessed the attack firsthand, time seemed to slow down. The images from that afternoon would remain burned into their memories long after the flames were extinguished. When paramedics arrived, Sarah was still alive. That fact alone seemed extraordinary. The injuries were catastrophic. Doctors would later determine that burns covered the vast majority of her body. Medical professionals faced a grim reality. The odds of survival were incredibly small. Family members braced themselves for devastating news. Many believed they were witnessing the final chapter of her life. Yet Sarah refused to surrender. Through unimaginable pain, she continued fighting. Day after day, her survival defied expectations. Surgeons performed procedure after procedure. Specialists worked tirelessly to keep her alive. What appeared impossible gradually became reality. Sarah endured when few thought she could. But as weeks turned into months, a painful truth became impossible to ignore. Sarah understood the severity of her condition better than anyone. She listened to doctors. She understood the risks. She knew that every day she remained alive was a victory. Yet she also recognized something that many people around her were afraid to say aloud. There was a real chance she would never walk into a courtroom. A real chance she would never sit before a jury and tell them what happened. And if that day never came, the man accused of destroying her life might never hear her final account of the truth. That realization would lead Sarah to make a decision that would eventually change the course of the entire case. The attack may have lasted only moments, but for Sarah, the consequences stretched across nearly 2 years. Her life became a cycle of hospital rooms, surgeries, rehabilitation sessions, and constant physical agony. Every movement brought pain. Every procedure carried new risks. Doctors worked tirelessly to repair the damage, but there were limits to what medicine could accomplish. Family members watched as she endured challenge after challenge, often wondering how much more a person could possibly withstand. Yet despite everything, Sarah remained remarkably focused. She was not consumed by anger. She was not obsessed with revenge. What drove her forward was something much simpler. She wanted accountability. She wanted the truth documented. She wanted the person responsible to face justice. Those goals became her purpose during the most difficult period of her life. As the months passed, prosecutors handling the case became increasingly concerned about a problem that could threaten the entire investigation. Sarah was alive, but her condition remained fragile. No one could predict how much time she had left. If she died before the trial began, the prosecution could lose its most powerful witness. There would still be evidence. There would still be witnesses, but nobody could tell the story with the same authority as Sarah herself. The possibility haunted everyone involved. Investigators had spent months building their case, yet the person at the center of it all might never have the opportunity to testify before a jury. Faced with that reality, prosecutors began exploring options that were rarely used and almost never under circumstances like these. Eventually, a decision was made. If Sarah might not survive long enough to testify in court, then her testimony would be preserved while she was still alive. Cameras were brought in. Lawyers prepared their questions. The process resembled a courtroom examination, even though the actual trial was still far away. Sarah understood the importance of what was happening. Sitting before the camera, she carefully recounted the events that had changed her life forever. She described her relationship with Michael. She explained what happened on the day of the attack. She identified the man she believed was responsible. Every answer became part of a permanent record. At the time, few people realized just how important those recordings would become. They appeared to be a precaution, something created in case the worst happened. Yet with each passing month, that possibility became harder to ignore. Then, the moment everyone feared finally arrived. After fighting for nearly 2 years, Sarah's body could no longer withstand the devastating injuries she had suffered. Complications related to the burns ultimately claimed her life. Family members mourned, friends grieved. Many assumed the most important chapter of the story had come to an end, but they were wrong. Sarah's death did not close the case. In many ways, it transformed it. Because although the woman at the center of the investigation was gone, her voice remained, waiting, preserved on video, ready to tell her story. And soon, a courtroom would have to decide whether a witness who had died could still testify against the man accused of killing her. Months after Sarah's death, the case entered a phase that would attract national attention. Prosecutors believed they had compelling evidence, but they also possessed something almost unprecedented. They had Sarah's recorded testimony, her words, her memories, her account of what happened. They wanted the jury to see and hear it for themselves. To the prosecution, it was the closest thing possible to having Sarah present in the courtroom, but the defense strongly disagreed. Attorneys representing Michael argued that allowing the recording would be unfair. They insisted that a witness who had died could no longer be questioned in the traditional sense before a jury. The issue quickly became one of the most important legal battles in the case. It was no longer just about what happened in that gas station parking lot. It was about whether Sarah's voice would be heard at all. As arguments unfolded, the judge faced an extraordinarily difficult decision. Whatever ruling was made would shape the direction of the trial. On one side stood prosecutors, determined to ensure that the victim's account remained part of the proceedings. On the other stood defense attorneys fighting to keep that testimony out. The courtroom waited, families waited, reporters waited. Then the decision finally arrived. The judge ruled that the jury would be allowed to see the recordings. In that moment, everything changed. What had begun as a precaution years earlier was now about to become one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in the entire case. When the day arrived, the courtroom fell silent. Every eye turned toward the screen. Jurors leaned forward. The tension was impossible to ignore. Then the video began to play, and there she was, Sarah, calm, focused, speaking directly into the camera. For a moment, it was as if time had folded in on itself. The woman everyone knew was gone suddenly seemed present once again. She described the events that had changed her life forever. She identified Michael. She recounted what she remembered. Her voice filled the courtroom, reaching the jurors exactly as prosecutors had hoped it would. There were no dramatic special effects, no emotional music, just the words of a woman determined to make sure her story survived her. The impact was profound. Sarah was no longer physically present, yet her testimony stood at the center of the trial. In a very real sense, she had become a witness in the case against the man accused of killing her. The very outcome she had feared she might never live to see was now unfolding before a jury. The preparation, the recordings, and the determination to preserve her account had accomplished exactly what she intended. Death had prevented her from entering the courtroom, but it had not prevented her from being heard. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, one question remained. Would Sarah's voice be enough to secure justice? The answer would determine not only Michael's future, but also how this extraordinary case would be remembered. Because by the time the verdict arrived, the story was no longer simply about a violent crime. It had become a story about perseverance, accountability, and a woman who refused to allow the truth to disappear with her. The final chapter was about to reveal whether that determination would ultimately prevail. As the trial approached its conclusion, it became clear that Sarah's recorded testimony had become far more than just another piece of evidence. Across the courtroom, people understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. Legal experts followed the case closely. Journalists analyzed every development. Families on both sides waited anxiously for the outcome. Yet what captured public attention most was not simply the legal arguments or the verdict itself. It was the image of a woman whose voice continued to shape the proceedings long after her death. Sarah had spent the final years of her life enduring pain that few could imagine, but she had also spent that time ensuring that her account would survive. In doing so, she transformed herself from a victim whose story might have ended in silence into a witness whose words could still be heard when it mattered most. When the verdict was finally delivered, it marked the end of a legal battle that had stretched across years of suffering, investigation, and uncertainty. For many observers, the outcome represented more than a courtroom decision. It represented a promise fulfilled. Sarah had feared she might never live to see justice. In the end, she didn't. Yet through the testimony she left behind, she remained part of the process she had fought so hard to reach. Her words traveled where she no longer could. They reached the jury. They entered the record. They became impossible to ignore. And perhaps that was the most powerful aspect of the entire story. The person at the center of the case never disappeared from it. Even today, the case continues to raise difficult questions. As technology advances, what role should recorded testimony play in criminal trials? If a victim knows they may not survive, should their preserved statements carry the same weight as live testimony? Can justice continue after death in ways that previous generations never imagined? There are no easy answers. Legal scholars continue to debate those questions. Courts continue to examine the implications. But regardless of where people stand, one fact remains undeniable. Michael could take away Sarah's future. He could take away her ability to stand in a courtroom, but he could not erase her voice. That is why this story remains so unforgettable. It is not only a story about violence, loss, or crime. It is a story about determination, about a woman who understood that her time was limited and decided to use every remaining moment to ensure that the truth would endure. When the courtroom needed its most important witness, Sarah was already there, not sitting in the gallery, not waiting outside the courthouse, but preserved in a recording that carried her words across time, ready to tell the jury exactly what happened. And in that moment, the woman who feared she would never see her day in court finally got the chance to be heard. Sarah's story may be over, but the questions it leaves behind are still being debated today. Should recorded testimony from a victim be allowed in murder trials after they've passed away? Does it help ensure justice is served when a victim can no longer speak for themselves? Or does it raise concerns about fairness and the rights of the accused? It's a difficult question, and one that continues to divide opinions. We'd love to hear what you think. Share your thoughts in the comments below and tell us where you stand on this extraordinary case. And if you thought Sarah's story was unbelievable, wait until you hear about the woman who attended her own funeral after discovering that her husband had allegedly hired killers to have her murdered. It's another real case that sounds almost impossible to believe until you learn what actually happened. If you enjoyed this story and want more true crime cases filled with shocking twists, courtroom drama, and real-life mysteries that seem stranger than fiction, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a future episode. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.